This video is to provide an overview of this module's topics, and that is the idea of assessing stimulus preference and then the direct assessment of reinforcers. The more common and I'd say popular of these two would be stimulus preference assessment, but there is a clear role, especially in research, for reinforcer assessment, and you need to understand the language and the risk of the procedures that are typically used in applied settings. There are many reasons to identify potential reinforcers in applied settings. Obviously, any intervention, a behavioral intervention or an intervention to increase or teach skills, should and is quite likely to involve reinforcement of one sort or the other. For any client that has learning difficulties, the appropriate use of reinforcers during instruction is absolutely critical. One of the problems I've seen in too many applied settings is a reluctance to routinely use reinforcers or to make any kind of assessment about the usefulness of any contingent stimuli for teaching skills or improving behaviors with people with disabilities. And certainly a functional behavior assessment of any sort is in fact a reinforcer assessment. You're assessing what consequences are maintaining problem behaviors as a critical component of intervention planning. And as we've talked about in the last several weeks, you're quite likely to use your information about what's reinforcing problem behaviors to change that reinforcement to make it contingent on appropriate behaviors. So for both improving behaviors that are considered skill-oriented and to reducing inappropriate behaviors, we're going to use reinforcement, and we have to have some kind of idea about what's potent. Otherwise, interventions are not going to be effective or more likely to be inefficient. So, how do we identify reinforcers accurately? Well, the most typical and common way, as we'll see, is that staff, parents, teachers, or even children themselves, for example, are often asked to report what they believe would be a reinforcer for themselves or for others. This sort of idea of reporting these things has not proven, unfortunately, to be very accurate. So we're going to talk about using two strategies, and that would be a stimulus preference assessment, and within that, the use of indirect methods initially, followed by a more direct assessment of stimulus preference. And then we'll talk briefly at the end of this about the role of direct reinforcer assessment in all of this. Before we begin with what you need to know and the topic at hand, I think it's important to remember some issues. The first one is that stimulus preferences and even the viability of stimuli as reinforcers changes over time. It's dynamic. It can be dynamic within a day or certainly dynamic across time. So what serves as a reinforcer at one point may eventually not serve as a reinforcer. In too many applied settings, I see the same stimuli being used as consequences over and over, and basically risking the idea of association, a motivating operation that would reduce the value of something as a reinforcer, or beginning even with a weak reinforcer and simply applying it over and over until it becomes completely ineffective. In preference assessments, the idea of doing something more than just asking someone doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be able to directly and clearly say that something is a reinforcer. The best we can do with these things, the most accurate, is to identify what is a preference and then to try it out. So through preference assessments, we can identify stimuli that a person prefers or someone thinks a person prefers. We can identify the relative values of different preferences. So maybe attention is a high preference item, we think, and playing with some activity is a low preference item. We could make those kinds of distinctions, at least tentatively. And we could certainly identify the conditions under which the preferences might or might not be true. We have three sort of, I think, general ways to do this. The first one is asking about stimulus preferences of someone, either through interviews, structured interviews, or surveys. There's some examples of these on the Blackboard site, and you can certainly find others on your own. The second way is we can observe what kinds of stimuli or activities people interact with under free offering conditions. Just putting them in a room, for example, and observing what they choose to interact with, and then making some assumptions that those would possibly serve as reinforcers if made contingent. Or we can actually present various stimuli in a series of what's called trial-based procedures and observe whether they pick one over the other or interact with one for longer times and so forth. As we'll see, reinforcer assessment, on the other hand, is a direct and experimental and a database method in which we actually present stimuli contingent on behavior and see what happens to the behavior. In other words, we test to see whether some preferred stimulus acts as a reinforcer, or how strong a reinforcer it is, or whether it's more reinforcing than some other stimuli. So you're really going to make a stimulus contingent on a target response and see what happens. This allows us to verify or confirm whether or not some stimulus functions as a reinforcer. And if for no other reason, reinforcer assessment procedures are useful in comparing different stimulus preference procedures or even surveys to see if one preference assessment is more likely to clearly identify actual reinforcers than another. And the only way to ultimately do that is to test it out. This is clearly the least used procedure in applied settings, but it does remain, I think, important, if for no other reason, to help us understand the relative utility of different stimulus preference procedures and how accurate they might be. So let's start with the simplest form of stimulus preference assessment, and that would be simply asking someone about preference, either asking someone about their preferences or asking teachers or caregivers or parents about what they think someone would prefer. These can be done through interviews, either informal or structured, and through surveys or checklists. And there are a variety of those that have been developed, and I suspect that many of you routinely use those. And unfortunately, the relative accuracy of some of these remains unknown. So we can use open-ended questions. We could ask a child, for example, what kinds of activities he would like to work to engage in. We could ask about whether he preferred certain items. We could ask a teacher or a parent about what they think about these things. We could provide choices to someone and ask which of two choices they think a child would most prefer, or in some cases, of course, you could ask the child. And there are procedures that allow us to put these in some kind of rank order, in other words, from high preference down to low preference, the idea being that high preference stimuli are more likely to be reinforcers, or more likely to be stronger reinforcers than low preference. And as you'll read, unfortunately, these conclusions are not always accurate. It's also common in applied settings, prior to some work activity, for example, to ask a client what they would like to do after they work, or what they would like to work for. In other words, you're asking them to tell you what would be ostensibly a reinforcer. And you could ask significant others prior to an activity what they think a person would like to. And those have some advantages in the sense that if you do it right before an activity, it doesn't take long, and it might possibly take into account changes in preferences from day to day. So these are not uncommon, or it's also not uncommon for some kinds of interventions to provide choice prior to an activity, and we've talked about that as a way to reduce the aversiveness of some activity and reduce escape-based misbehavior. So this is, in essence, a form of stimulus preference assessment. All these processes of asking about preferences or using surveys tend to be relatively uncomplicated and simple. The problems are the verbal reports or survey responses may not actually respond to real-world contingencies or real-world behavior. You get a high number of false positives, meaning people identify stimuli as likely reinforcers when in fact they're not reinforcing at all. And you might get a relatively low number of false negatives, in the sense that they say it's not a reinforcer when in fact it is. Both those things can occur, and research is very clear about this. And so those are the problems. The advantages are it's simple, uncomplicated. The disadvantages is the accuracy may be questionable. The next method is free operant observation. That's simply observing and recording what kinds of activities a person engages in when she or he has unrestricted choice of activities. Free operant observation usually measures the amount of time someone spends engaging in something, but it could also measure just whether or not something is engaged in. So you could assess duration or you could assess contact, and we'll come back to this concept of how you assess choice and what have you. So there's no real response requirements. They don't really have to do anything. You just turn them loose and let them and see what they do. You want to certainly make sure that the stimuli in which you got an interest were available and within sight and reach, that they weren't removed, and this can be done in a contrived or a naturalistic way, as we'll see in a moment. Contrived free operant observation, where you would schedule a period and you would provide the learner with some non-contingent exposure to each item to make sure they sample them. You place all the items in view and within reach, and then you would just observe, and you would record the duration of time spent engaging in each item, and with the idea that the items chosen and engaged in for longer periods are higher preference. You can imagine there's some problems with these, so you might have one item that's truly the highest preference, and then you might miss the fact that other items that you're not engaged in would serve as a reinforcer. They're just going to be overshadowed by a very, very high preference kind of thing. But this is not, this is certainly relatively simple and straightforward to do. On the other hand, you could do it in a more naturalistic way, and you could just have a room, a classroom, for example, or a playroom. Items could be distributed around there, and then you could just observe for half an hour, say, and do the same kind of thing. Obviously, all of these observed things require some kind of recording sheet in which you would have identified the items and a way to measure time, stopwatch, or some other kind of digital means that would allow you to look at the accumulated time that a person spends engaging in activities. The advantage of these methods are they're relatively less time-consuming than trial-based methods, and of course they're less likely to produce any problem behavior because there are going to be at least some preferred stimuli in which a person can engage. So those are advantages of the free operant assessment of preference. Now, over the past 20 or 30 years, there have been a number of other procedures that are simply called trial-based methods, in which, in a rather structured fashion, selected stimuli are presented to children in a series of trials. And then, for example, you might present two items in front of a child and have them pick one. You could measure simply which one they pick or contact, or in the case of edibles, which one they consume. You could also put them in front of a child and for 2 minutes measure the duration, and the one that the child engages in for the longest period of time will be considered to be a higher preference. There are many variations of these things, and you're certainly going to read about these, and I'm not going to try to describe them all right now, but there are different ways to do this that we'll talk about here in a second. Let me also say that I provided you links on Blackboard to two very nice videos where paired stimuli and multiple stimuli without replacement are shown. You can see someone doing this, and it has nice caption in these little videos that allow you to understand and see if you've never done this. But the first one would be a single stimulus presentation, where you would present a stimulus one at a time in some random order and record the reaction. The reaction could be either in how long they interact with it before you put it down, or whether or not they interact with it. This is well suited for individuals sometimes who have the more significant disabilities and have difficulty in selecting two or more stimuli. You can still get a relative measure of preference by selecting a number of stimuli and doing this. I should add right now that how does one identify the stimuli which need to be tested or examined? And the most common way is to use one of the less formal ways of doing that, surveys or interviews, to identify a set of stimuli that someone believes are likely to be items that would be preferred, and thus are likely to be items that could serve as reinforcers. So it's like a funnel-shaped approach. You start wide and identify a smaller set of items, and then those are directly examined through one of these trial-based methods. All these methods of course are described clearly in your textbook, and there's a review article that reviews the evidence for any of these and draws some conclusions about them. But the second one is called a paired stimulus presentation, and there's one of the videos that you're linked to on Blackboard clearly shows this. It's like a forced choice method. Two stimuli are presented simultaneously, and the target person is asked to choose one or pick the one they like better or some other stimulus. Each stimulus in a set is matched with every other one in a separate trial. And then the percent of trials where an item is available, that the percent of those trials that the item is actually contacted or chosen is the measure of preference. And you can rank order that way from high, medium, and low. And so if you have 6 items, you'd have to have usually, I think that 6 or 7 items would take 20 or more trials to show, so that every item was paired with every other item. And then that whole set of comparisons would typically be replicated several times in order to produce these percentages. So this can take a while, but it has proven to have some validity in ending up with rank ordered sets of stimuli from low to high, and the high preference items can then be used and have been identified as reinforcers. And now we have the multiple stimulus presentations. We've gone from 1 stimulus at a time to 2, and now there could be 3 or more. The video you'll see uses 7, and there are procedures to do this where you set it up, and you can either be done with replacement or without replacement. So with replacement, without replacement, you'd have 1 trial, 7 items would be out there, the child would be told to pick one. The one he picked would then be removed and not shown again. The next trial there would have 6 items, and they would be rearranged in a fashion you can see on the video, the common way to do this, so they're not in the same order. And then the child is asked to pick from those 6. The one that's picked is removed. So that's without replacement. With replacement, you would simply have a trial where you presented the same 7, the child picked one, and you would replace it and do another trial. I think typically the evidence seems reasonable to me that the multiple stimulus without replacement is the preferred option. And again, you would have several replications of the without replacement, the 7, the 6, and 5, and so forth, and the data would still be the same. It's the percent of trials in which an item was available that it was chosen. And this again allows one to rank order preferences among those, in this case, 7 stimuli that I've been talking about. So your book talks a little bit about guidelines for selecting which kind you would like to use, or what might be the best thing, and it will vary across client characteristics and so forth. But you do want to have some method to produce a smaller set across which to examine. And of course, you've got to consider how long these things will take against the value that, in the sense that they produce stimuli that do serve as reinforcers and improve intervention. You have to balance those things. Ranking the stimuli makes sense to me. Your data allow you to do that, and just because some item is ranked the highest doesn't mean that other items would not also serve as reinforcers. And remember, the same stimulus used over and over again as a consequence can produce satiation and reduce the value. So always, I think, in interventions you want to have a variety of available consequences that could serve as reinforcers. When your time is limited for these assessments, then you would use fewer stimuli in your array of assessed preferences. So instead of using 7, you might use 4. And again, I think you do want to replicate whatever set of things you do several times in order to be more accurate. These are discussed in readings, and again, you've got those videos from YouTube to look at. And finally, we have the direct reinforcer assessments. I just want you to be able to define what these are. Again, these procedures require an experimental design and, of course, more stringent data collection, but they do allow you to directly determine if something is a reinforcer. So they're the ultimate arbitrator, if you will, if you want to use them this way, and they've been used in research to see which of several preference assessments produces clear and accurate information about what's a reinforcer, or about the relative nature of the reinforcement. There are 3 ways that your book talks about. The concurrent schedule assessment, when you have, for example, 2 behaviors, each of which produces a different consequence, and you can, in fact, then see what rates of behavior are highest. and the behavior that has the highest response rate, the assumption would be that is, of course, being reinforced by the most potent reinforcer. You could take a look at, for example, figure 1111, your textbook, and that's discussed, and you can see how that would be used. There's also a multiple schedule reinforcer assessment where only one schedule is in effect at a time with an appropriate SD, and you compare the relative levels. That can also be used in a single fashion where you have a baseline and then you have a schedule where one consequence is assessed to see if in fact it is a reinforcer. You could compare that to another phase where another consequent was employed to see if it is a reinforcer and which one would be higher. So I think these things do have use, especially in the basic research about the utility of the preference assessments. And I can see, although I've not experienced this myself, where it could be useful with a very difficult to teach client when you really had not been successful in identifying an array of effective reinforcers. That's the overview, and you've got on Blackboard an article to read, a description of an exact procedures as was used in an article, 2 Blackboard YouTube videos, some examples of surveys, and so forth. And you have your objectives that will allow you to understand these things. For those of you that are looking for your BCBA, you need to know the terms, obviously, and I think for anybody that works with persons with disabilities, these procedures should be part of your professional repertoire and are very useful.